So, welcome everyone. Welcome Matthew, welcome Anna. Happy Earth Day, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. I am Ludovica, the Associate Curator of Sanme Gallery. For whom who don't know, Sanme is an independent space for contemporary art in South London, committed to research-led collaborative exchanges. And today, in this very special day, we are very happy and honored to have Anna Lawrence and Mathew Beach with us. This talk is in conjunction with our current exhibition, The Herbarium Shadow by Mathew Beach, that is now open and will be running until May 22nd. I will let Mathew later talk to you about the exhibition. Mathew is an artist and geographer. His practice explores the entanglements between place, topographic, care in modern human worlds. He is currently at a teaching and research fellow in printmaking at City and Guilds of London Art School, and also a PhD candidate in the School of Geography at Queen Mary, London, researching historical and contemporary practices of producing and consuming gelatin and collagen peptides. Anna Lawrence is an historical and cultural geographer interested in plant and human relations, researching the socio-political lives of flowers in Victorian Britain. And she's a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge and King's College. I will now leave it to them. Just for practical reason, I'll have to ask you to mute your microphones. And if you have any questions, there will be time after the conversation for you to type the conversation in the chat or ask them, unmute yourself and ask them. And we will be discussing all together. This talk is recorded. We would like to upload it online. If this is a problem for you, you can just type your question instead of muting yourself, or you can also cut the video and just speak. But also, if you really have a major issue with being recorded, please just tell us after this conversation and we won't be uploading this online. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today and happy Earth Day. I'm just going to try to share my screen briefly to have a couple of slides. Okay, can everyone see PowerPoint?
Yes.
And can you see PowerPoint and not see my text that I have in front of me as well?
We just see the first slide that you are selected on, but maybe you want to enter the full screen. That would be maybe easier.
Yes, my only concern is whether or not I can also, yeah, I can, great, okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Great, all right, as Ludwika has said, my name is Mathew Beach. I'm an artist and researcher and the creator of the works in the Herbarium Shadow. This afternoon, Anna Lawrence and I will converse about how we as humans can problematize or make more complex our relationships with botanical beings and domesticity, whether gardening in the urban interior or cultivating in one's backyard from our prospective research areas. Quickly offering some context here, the exhibition is the first public display of ongoing research and practice, first developed while attending the short-term residency program Lab Verde and the Brazilian Amazon rainforest in 2019. And I have a slide here just from Lab Verde's website. Equally, I want to briefly plug the 2021 Lab Verde Festival, which presents a set of artistic works on the different dimensions of Amazonian time and will be celebrated the first week of June, coinciding with Environment Week. And it'd be great if you could check that out, because I know that there, obviously the festival's been postponed due to COVID, and completely acknowledging the situation with COVID in Brazil as well. So Anna and I first met in the summer of 2019 in the US, where we both presented on a session at the American Association of Geographers annual meeting entitled Vegetal Geographies, which aimed to highlight the place of plants and multi-species research and to bring matters of injustice and human-plant relations in from the periphery of the more than human. So I proposed this conversation as part of my exhibition proposal to Sanme, after really enjoying Anna's presentation and research and seeing crossover in the ways we approached research practice in plants. So again, just to introduce Anna, she's a geography PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. Her work centers on the interdisciplinary realm of critical plant studies and which centers the plant and the analysis and uses specific flowers as windows onto a variety of themes, including botanical science, domestic floriculture, commodity culture, philanthropy, and settler colonialism. Methodologically, her archival work is pieced together in fragments as a bricolage, weaving together stories of flowers alongside theoretical engagement with what it means to understand how we might extract value in interpretation of our own entangled co-constitution with vegetal life in the context of contemporary environmental crises. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous, so please excuse any kind of fumbles in my wording. Common between each of our interests are concerns around the unseen circulation and domesticity. An apt entrance point into Anna's work in the context of the exhibition might be the reproductive biology of philodendron plants. And so here I have a slide of 3 different philodendron species and households that I've pulled off Google Images. And what I want to point out here, and I think can somebody nod, can you see my cursor kind of floating around the screen? So an inflorescence is basically these, what are kind of what hold the flowers on the philodendron plant. And an inflorescence is basically like a kind of cloak that houses a group of flowers in a spike called a spadex, which is kind of this long pointy thing. And why I've kind of chosen this area as a point of kind of entry into into our conversation is because it's quite difficult to achieve the conditions necessary for philodendrons to flower in interior spaces, and they're not often seen, which goes back to this kind of concern around what's seen and what's not seen kind of in the research and practice of domestic horticulture and floriculture. And so this is not least because philodendrons are often transported multiple places before arriving in their final destination to experience existence in domestic space, which potentially involves assaults their root systems via repotting, climatic changes, propagating, and other traumas. So this is to say that any philodendron staged to carry out life as a houseplant in a particular location must go through a period of acclimation prior to any further growth and development. And then just to say here that the plant in the gallery space as part of the exhibition is no exception to this. So the plants that's in the gallery space, there's originally 2 plants that came from parts of the UK. And they actually lived, because of all the postponements, they basically lived in my house for a year. So they were acclimatized to the house, grew quite a bit. I had to chop them off because they hit the ceiling several times. And now they're in the gallery space. But kind of in that process, what's unseen by the general public is the process of a lot of the lower leaves on the vines yellowing and being removed due to transport stress, or trying to ascertain the correct watering schedule in the context of the temperature and humidity in the gallery space, as opposed to the home, which, while similar, isn't exact. And obviously it's not the same as it would be in Brazil or other parts of the tropics and subtropics. So going on to our conversation, these aspects of domestic horticulture lead me to ask an initial question about Anna's research. So Anna, I know you've conducted field work in the last year in New Zealand, working in archives and gathering empirical material on settler colonial floriculture. On the aspect of philodendrons behaving differently in different spaces, could you talk about some of the familiar plants in the UK being transported to another part of the world and the kind of processes involved in that? And so I'm looking over here because your picture's on this side of the screen.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as we speak, I've also got some plants acclimatizing in my garden. I'm trying to put some little salvia cuttings that I've been, not cutting, seedlings that I've been trying to cultivate that are looking extremely sad. And I thought, no, it's such a sunny day, I'd try and put them outside to get them used to it. It's not going very well. But thinking about, your sort of comment made me initially go to this source that I remember reading in the archives about this woman who was speaking about apple blossom that was flowering in May in New Zealand. And I guess the interesting thing about transplanting plants to the opposite hemisphere is, of course, the seasonality and everything is directly reversed. And so it takes both humans and plants quite a period of time to get used to that reversal. And so she was writing, and of course, in New Zealand, apple blossom should not be flowering in May because that would be autumn there. So this is an extract from a diary in 1851, and this woman, Martha Adams, writes that this is proving the struggle going on in the nature of these trees until they become accustomed to the change of the seasons and so learn to bloom at the right period. But for her, having these flowers there at this time of year as a sort of May Day celebration was really important sort of process for her to make sense of her new landscape and to feel more at home in that space. And so although that kind of transplant shock, like you were talking about, takes several seasons to overcome, it's a sort of comforting presence. And so I just think it's really interesting how, different plants will take lots of different times to adjust to that, or to then behave completely differently than you might expect in those spaces. So I mean, similarly, Martha Adams emigrated in 1850, and she remarks upon, for example, geraniums that could grow up to 9 feet tall in New Zealand, and they could flower like all year round, and they could be outside of the house, which was really unusual for people to experience in Britain. And so there are all these fascinating, and sort of Cape Pelargoniums that can grow from a single cutting within 2 months to expand out to a plant of sort of 24 inches in diameter.
Wow.
So alien to the sort of typical growth patterns of plants in Britain.
How does that? So, I mean, having been to you've been to New Zealand, what is the kind of, I guess, relative humidity and sort of temperature and light? Sort of how is that different? And so, I guess something coming from a background in art, I'm so used to sort of like seeing archival sources around photography that talk about the quality of light being different in the kind of, particularly I suppose in the UK versus like the East Coast United States. Are there sort of did the sources speak about that kind of context of, I guess, acclimatization? Yeah,
I mean, I think they were sort of remarkable, the sources that I've come across anyway, which are mostly letters and diaries and things at this point, were remarkably absent talking about climate and sort of questions like that, which, and again, within New Zealand, there was obviously massive variation between the North and the South Islands, and so it depended where people were settling. But then there were all sorts of efforts to try and they had competitions in newspapers to try and construct a sort of diary, an agricultural diary, basically, for people to tell people when to grow different things at certain times, because this was one of the most difficult things to adjust to, was when do you plant certain things. And again, this was completely different whether you were at the top of the North Island or the bottom of the South. They're very different sort of climatic regions. But that took quite a long time to sort of become recognised and to filter through that sort of knowledge, which led to basically there was just a lot of experiment in what plants worked where. But yeah, one thing that struck me when I went was agapanthus, which are those lovely sort of big, purple flowers originally from South Africa, but were also introduced in the sort of 19th century. And they are now classed as a noxious weed in New Zealand because they're absolutely everywhere. You go to Auckland especially, or Wellington, and I couldn't believe it because they're obviously grown as sort of beautiful ornamental flowers in people's front gardens here in the UK. But there, people are trying to get rid of them, and they are absolutely everywhere. But I suppose because of their beauty, they occupy that sort of awkward middle ground of people sort of like them for giving a sort of special, personality to the space almost. But then they're also, noxious weeds technically, and damaging to local ecologies.
Are there any examples of that, like in the reverse, plants that might have been brought over accidentally from the UK that we might think as being kind of ubiquitous, but that are now in New Zealand quite prized?
There almost certainly are. Nothing particularly comes to mind, to be honest. I'm most sort of thinking about, all the other sort of invasive species like gorse and things that have taken over and are extremely pernicious. But there were definitely a lot of flowers, particularly that really struggled to to assert themselves within that space initially. So a lot of wildflowers, such as primroses and snowdrops and sort of violets and these kind of things, the smaller flowers from Britain, took a long time to get established, potentially because of a lack of pollinators that were there. It's sort of unclear, but from the sources that I've been reading, all of these women's letters, they were writing home to their families, asking them again and again to send them seeds and bulbs and cuttings of all of these flowers, and primroses and snowdrops are the things that come up the most frequently in those kind of pleas.
That makes me think of two kind of points to raise on the. So you mentioned the kind of the text, I suppose, or the guide for growing in the new environment. Like that makes me think of kind of the gendered aspect of this, sort of who is doing that kind of labor of the planting and the care, both, and I guess kind of in multiple aspects, sort of who's caring for the plants on the ground in New Zealand, who's sort of writing these guides, who's caring for them on the voyages over, who's sending them. How is that kind of present in the sources?
Yeah, definitely. It's really interesting. And I mean, perhaps somewhat predictably, in terms of who is doing the sort of more academic work of writing these sorts of guides and things, that is men, typically, who'd be sort of doing, undertaking those and setting up, for example, institutions like horticultural societies. That was a very sort of masculine realm. And I guess, I mean, my interest in flowers and how they get to New Zealand, it sort of started off because I think there's quite a lot done on plants going the other way, perhaps sort of exotic plant hunting expeditions and sending these sort of male heroic figures out to the colonies, and then they sort of send things back. And then there's quite a lot on industrial plant transfers as well, sort of between colonies or between botanic gardens, with Kew in London typically as the centre of those sorts of exchanges. But actually, for New Zealand specifically, because it was quite a planned settler colony, because it was it sort of planned out to be a better Britain. It was a very purposeful venture, and actually the individual agency of the settlers themselves really comes through, and typically then the women when it comes to flowers anyway, because the men, reading the men's letters at this point, which I did try to do a few for sort of balance, typically they're talking about agricultural grasses, and there's so much about grass. If you're interested in grass, there's a hell of a lot there, but the flowers really don't come through at all in their writing. And then you look at all of the women's letters, and that was the only thing. And soft fruit, which also seems to be one of those strangely gendered things. Men are into the vegetables, and then women have the sort of flowers and soft fruit for whatever reason. Perhaps it's sort of more of a luxury. I suppose it's not a necessity of life having your strawberries and raspberries and things. Mm-hmm. But so yeah, definitely the women were driving in the early years these sort of more informal transfers of flowers especially, and it was really driven by the affective dimension and their emotions, in terms of what sorts of flowers they wanted that would connect them to their spaces back home, and it was the ones that reminded them of their home spaces that were valued most strongly, especially literally the same flowers, you know, that were grown from cuttings or seeds of particular plants that they remember from back home. Which is really nice. And so the gardens become these memorial grounds of individual relationships.
Could you talk maybe a bit about kind of I guess that construction of value and the kind of how the flowers add value to domestic space, and sort of, I guess, are there accounts of like where does that domestic space start being built or sort of embodied? Kind of do they write about the experiences on or trying to cultivate the flowers on the ship? And actually, one thing I wanted to ask you is like, do they talk about trying to get things to flower on the ship specifically, and sort of how that kind of acts with like the salty sea air, or what have you, and then kind of how that becomes literally transplanted, but also metaphorically transplanted into becoming domestic space, sort of on the ground post landing.
Definitely. Well, and again, it's such a sort of process of experimentation, which I think is kind of lost, or in these sorts of accounts of the course of Wardian cases, for example, transplanting plants around, it was an experiment at first, but then it very quickly became a more sort of industrial process, I guess. But then in these accounts of women requesting certain flowers and things, yeah, you've got, so for example, a shipboard diary of this woman called Mary Wallace in 1859. And she writes that we are taking out some large boxes to a gardener in New Zealand, and some of the leaves gets their way through the boxes. They are prized very much. It shows us how little we think of things when we have them, but deprive us of them, even a green leaf, how it is valued. And so I think the dislocation, the sort of extreme dislocation of these voyages, which would have taken between 3 to 6 months, really drove home sort of, what people miss, what sort of absences are really felt at that time. And for example, these diaries talk a lot about seabirds and sort of animals that you see along the way, and whales and sharks that were hunted. The men got to hunt sharks and albatross for fun, whereas the women weren't allowed in quite a lot of spaces on the boat, so it wasn't a great experience for them. But this sort of shows how just individual plants could be really prized on the ship themselves. And Mary Wallace, she also tried to cultivate a lily and some crocuses in a pot. That was the only instance that I found in the archives of someone actually actively trying to make things flower on the ship, because she thought that it would be nice for Easter Sunday to have some flowers and surprising her friends, which there's no account whether this actually worked or not. I don't know whether these plants flowered in the end, but she was complaining about the high moisture levels and trying to keep them dry and moving them around on the ship to try and make these things work. But we do know also that when she got to New Zealand, the first time that she saw wildflowers, this is accounts, that it made my eyes fill with tears. I do not know whether to say of joy or grief. It was a mixture of both. So clearly for her individually, flowers meant an awful lot, and were a really important, part of her life, definitely. And there are all sorts of other fascinating accounts of the sort of particularities of how people were trying to experiment with sending seeds for example, in placing them in a basket. So one method was to place them in papers and then place them in a basket to be hung up in the ship, and then taken out and hung on deck occasionally in fine weather, which seems quite a labour-intensive way to do it. And apparently the guy who was writing this letter said that the ship's captain should take charge of that. I think they probably have better things to do, really, than carrying around baskets of seeds. But I think, this particular individual was a judge and a very important member of society, and so he got his way and he got his seeds in a good condition. But others involved smashing soft fruit on paper to try and preserve the seeds in that way, and that was quite a successful method. Or placing each seed individually in brown paper or lead paper and then placing them in a tin case was another good method. But roots and bulbs and tubers and things were much harder to get across without them getting damp. So they were often put in sand, but then that would get damp and would lead to rot quite frequently. So it was a difficult way of getting things across.
It's quite interesting thinking about kind of not wanting things to get damp and transport as it relates to plant matter, because I suppose particularly with houseplants, it's almost the opposite. So we think about like we talked about, I suppose we have this like kind of combined interest in circulation and sort of like, at least from like my kind of practice, I guess, is like in a houseplant hobby, is it's all about, if you ship a plant or if you have a plant shipped to you, it's all about how do we keep the roots moist? And I suppose even in the gallery plant now, so for those that haven't been able to attend, the way we have the plant kind of growing is we've got these felt pockets. I think Rufus is in the chat, just to plug Rufus Rock here, who was very instrumental in figuring out the best way to do that. So we basically got these felt pockets that are tied to the column that we're kind of trying to grow them in, and it's been a trial and error thing, trying to figure out how frequently to keep them watered. But yeah, I guess on circulation, how could you say something maybe about the kind of the process of gathering the seeds? I guess like that kind of like I guess I can also say more maybe about the kind of is there a contrast, maybe is what I'm trying to get at, between what now seems to be kind of continuing to be this sort of mass industrial production of houseplants versus this more kind of, at least from what you said so far, I guess smaller scale community driven or sort of even family driven kind of collection of seeds, and kind of, yeah, how is that sort of featured in your work and research around, just well, really around the kind of collection of seeds and transport of seeds in the both the lens of mass industrial space and more individual or family driven or collective driven practice.
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, from the beginning of colonialism in New Zealand, for example, the very first newspaper that was published in, well, I want to say 1840, I might have got that wrong, or before. There were, adverts for seedsmen, industrially produced professional seedsmen were advertising their services to try and send seeds out there to people. But typically, I mean, there's one, I don't know where I've got this quote, if I do somewhere. Yeah, there's one remark here that, for example, reads, this is again Martha Adams, that many of the vegetable seeds that she took bought commercially like this actually failed because they weren't particularly good at this time of making sure that they were packaged correctly, and it was, a business deal rather than family members who are taking great care over doing these, packaging seeds and things. But then she said that all of the seed from Friends has sprung up beautifully, as if it knew the donor's wishes. When the seeds spring up, call the flowers by our names. And so it's this, I guess, the sort of duty of care over the certain seeds and how that translates to which ones are successful or not, and the sort of tenacity, the sheer tenacity of these friends and family of sending seeds constantly in every letter. Some of them would receive seeds in every single letter. And they would just try them and see what worked, and the sort of urgency with which people would then put them into the ground to see what came up. And some people would put them into the ground, not even in their own gardens, in friends' gardens, if they were sort of nearer by, just to hope that something was cultivated, and then they distribute them around the colony amongst friends, and these sort of informal networks were incredibly important. And I think, I mean, why I'm particularly interested in it, and it's relevant even today in terms of thinking about what plants mean to people who've been displaced from their homes for whatever reason, voluntarily or not, and what our attachments to plants mean in these sorts of contexts. And it's sort of the role of the garden or the domestic plant space as memory work, I guess, and I don't think it is a case of trying to recreate a particular space or an aesthetic. It's not about sort of how accurate you can make a space, but it's something more sort of insidious about the individual plants and utilizing the individual plant's power in terms of triggering visceral memory, or through sort of smell or touch, or the plant's movements. And it's much more about that relationship rather than a sort of construction of space, which I think is typically how people think about plants, because they are thought of as the sort of environment. You're constructing space, but as much as you are constructing space, you're also sort of constructing more individual, small-scale relationships, I guess. So I think, I mean, I'm fascinated by the ability of plants to kind of collapse space and time in that way. And there's something, and I think the sort of context of 19th century New Zealand is very stark because of that extreme dislocation, I say, of space and time. People travelling out for 6 months, not necessarily knowing if they would ever return. And I think that really draws attention to, there's something really special about knowing that you're cultivating the same dahlia plant that your family has in Birmingham in the UK. And it's literally materially of the same thing, and you can nurture it and you can care for it, and in so doing you can kind of care for those relationships that are distant. And I don't sort of quite know how to put it into words, but there's something really there about the fact that these plants, the materiality of these plants and flowers, can stand for simultaneously that individual plant itself, but also stand for a sort of greater collective. It's representative, but it's more than just representative of the whole. but it's of the same matter somehow. So I'm still trying to sort of put that into words for my own thinking. But I think it's really fascinating. Yeah, that sort of memory work and how plants kind of exist between temporalities. They exist between the past, present, and the hope of future. That's the whole sort of point of establishing a garden, I guess.
It's interesting sort of thinking about, again, I go back to this difference between sort of what seems to be much more, well, I guess it's maybe less, not industrial, but maybe differently industrial to how I understand the kind of mass houseplant market today. And it's really interesting to hear you talking about sort of being the materiality being of the same, cells and everything, and sort of that directly tied to that other location. And that makes me think about I guess, and this is the question, is there kind of the way that houseplants are reproduced is now it's in Southeast Asia, they're in sort of these large nurseries, which go through a process called tissue culture, which you might already be aware of, but for those that aren't, it's basically, it's a process of taking a piece of plant matter, applying growth hormone to it, and it reproduces in a test tube in such a way that it grows growth shoots before it grows roots. So you can reproduce plants very quickly in a small scale of time, and I mean tens of thousands in the span of a couple of months. And I'm gonna see if I can just turn my computer around to be able to show you one plant, for example. So I think you can see that on the ground. So that's a Epipremnum aurea, or golden pothos. But that's just one example of a plant that would have almost 100% have gone through that process. And I know that so even in my own home, I have plants that were given to me from friends and family that are from their own plants. And I guess so the question is do you think there's something lost or is there something gained in that different kind of register between knowing, I guess sort of, is there something is that relationship change based on the kind of history that we know about it, going back to the seen and the unseen? And again, trying to problematize our relationships with plants that we have in domestic space today.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it just makes me think of, I suppose, the current craze for houseplants in general, and the sort of very strong reaction that a lot of people have to that in terms of, when do you become like a plant person? And a lot of people, I guess, maybe are quite, I don't know if snobby is the right word, but sort of like, oh no, you're not really a plant person. You're just like catching on to this current fashion. I suppose I sort of personally, maybe I also have of that opinion slightly in terms of seeing websites, advertising lots of plants that you can get delivered to your door, like once a month. You can have subscription services for plants.
Box.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think is, I don't know, I think is crazy. And I must admit, sort of to thinking, oh, that kind of undermines what it means to cultivate plants, because you're just buying, you're sort of buying it as an object, as a commodity, I suppose. And of course, then people, I'm sure, go on to cultivate relationships with those plants, hopefully they'll be long lasting. But I'm sure a lot of people don't know how to care for them, perhaps, or receive so many different types of plants that not all of them are going to survive. Whereas if, I suppose, it speeds up the process, right? And plants are, well, some plants aren't slow, but plants typically are a kind of slowing down of time, and it's an adjusted temporality to ours, and we sort of adjust to that ourselves in learning how to take care of them and establish relationships with them, I suppose. And it does concern me, perhaps, that it would be too easy to rely too heavily on sort of advice of others, all of these like advice videos or sort of plant doctors on TikTok and YouTube and things of like how to, this is how you care for these types of plants. Whereas actually, of course, plants will respond very differently to all sorts of different environments. And there's so many different variables that as much as these pieces of advice are good, really you need to cultivate your own relationship within that specific space. It'll be different within different rooms in your house. It'll be completely transformed. And so I suppose I personally perhaps put more value on those plants that I can trace a history with, trace a personal history with. Like, here is one, for example, which is an oxalis cutting from which I took from a plant that my grandmother had, and after she died, my family had this plant for a long time, and it was looking rather poorly a couple of years ago, and so I took a cutting and tried to cultivate it, which is now this plant that's doing quite well. But this means a lot to me, the sort of individual plant, because it's a sort of part of my family history, I suppose, a lot more than some of the other plants around me that I bought further down the line. So I think it definitely does affect the value and our relationships of it.
There's something I'm trying to be. I was really struck by seeing the flower on the oxalis, because anytime I houseplant flowers indoors, it's like, oh my God, like you've done it, like you're the plant person. But I'm just wondering about. I'm not sure how to I think there's a question here, but it's going to come off as a comment. I hope the question comes forward. I guess I'm just wondering about this sort of and this comes from my just lack of understanding of, I suppose, just flowers as being a part of a plant that is sort of admired or desired, other than the foliage. But is there how do I phrase this? Just I guess what is that kind of on that kind of system of value around? How is that kind of constructed, or within those sort of histories around what, or maybe a question is what happens to those flowers after they've bloomed? Are they sort of, is that something, and this is maybe goes back to, I think there's a one of the events is on flower arrangements as part of the exhibition. Are these flowers something that are admired kind of in situ? Are they kind of going out to this space, and is that a way of kind of I guess becoming with the new kind of domestic exterior, or are they brought in just what happens to them after they've bloomed?
Definitely. But I mean, in a sort of typical response to your comment, more than a question, I don't know if I can directly speak to what happens to them afterwards, but I've definitely got thoughts in terms of how flowers are valued differently to plants in general, because obviously they're sort of ephemeral beings, and they have very different sort of constructions. And I think, the reason why I'm doing all of my work on flowers is because they hide so much with their sort of external beauty, and everyone loves flowers, and it's assumed to be something that's sort of common to all cultures and all types of people and all classes and so on. But what does that hide, I suppose? What sort of relations or assumptions do we put on our supposed love of flowers that really don't come through very strongly? And I suppose, again, within the sort of Victorian context, flowers were very heavily moralized as sort of emblems of God's creation, first and foremost. But then their beauty was seen as a very clear marker of civilization. And if you can appreciate the beauty of a flower, the ephemeral beauty of this really simple sort of creation of God, then you were a sort of a person of good moral value, and you could appreciate the finer things in life. And that meant that you sort of transcended the realm of civilization. And I guess because civilization, in a very racist, racialized way, was often associated with agriculture, for a start. So if you could, in terms of the 19th century hierarchies of indigenous peoples, it was very strongly related to who could cultivate the land, seemingly in a sort of recognizable way. So this is a reason, for example, in Australia, why indigenous peoples there weren't recognized as being sort of civilized, because their form of agriculture wasn't recognized as a legitimate form of sort of European Western style agriculture. We just didn't sort of understand. And so I suppose floral cultivation goes one step beyond that mere cultivation of the land, which is the sort of basis for the establishment of a civilized society, then if you can cultivate the land and produce things that are superfluous luxuries that aren't sort of necessary to feed us and sustain us, then that must be a symptom of some sort of greater humanizing force, even greater form of civilization. And so in that way, flowers were enrolled in all sorts of really dubious projects that were heavily classed, gendered, racialized within the context of settler colonies, and both within sort of working class spaces in Britain itself. And I think that those legacies of flowers in that sense has sort of continued today. We still sort of see them, you know, if you see a house down your street with a window box of flowers, you think, oh, that's a person who takes care of their house, who it's some sort of external show of like a sort of a good, that they're a good person, you know, they care. I don't know, maybe it is just caught up with caring. But I think it really does affect how we view people in those spaces. Streets with flowers are seen to be much like more inviting, nicer places, and are used in some places quite literally to sort of fight crime and to dissuade people from using, you know, public spaces in certain ways. If you put flowers in, then it sort of changes the whole look of an area, right? And that's a very Victorian idea, really, that's still seen quite a lot today, I suppose.
And that makes me think, you mentioned sort of seeing the window box on that's sort of on your street, and sort of that's somebody that cares. That it makes me think about, I suppose, in the terms of houseplants or tropical and subtropical plants, this idea of it's also a moralizing aspect, I think, for some people in the hobby to look after and cultivate specific plants, because they're seen as what's that? I guess endangered. Can I say endangered for? I guess I can say endangered for plants. So because they're endangered in their native habitats due to either poaching to be used in domestic space, or just due to, I suppose, deforestation, which of course has all sorts of other inclinations around land use and who gets to use the land and for what purposes. But it makes me think about this idea of the plant as conservation, or sort of the hobbyist growing the plant for conservation. And I guess it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about kind of how various seeds are sort of decided, and then sort of under what scale, and also on this mass production of houseplants, and on the note of sort of being materially the same, because there's like sort of this collapse of I guess of like genetic information in the plant. If it's cultivated for conservation, because you're always only kind of doing this one register of a plant, and sort of this. So yeah, trying to understand how we kind of cultivate identity or altruism, but sort of what gets left out, that kind of formation of identity, based on sort of what actually is sort of good for the plant itself, in a different context.
And removing it from its sort of ecological relations in that space, like how can you sort of cultivate a plant for conservation whilst also removing it from that? I don't know. Does it work? Does conservation sort of work like that? I guess.
So
when maybe, but
sorry, say again.
Does conservation, you know, can we call that sort of plant conservation? I guess you know. It's preserving that individual plant. I guess it's the same as with seed banks and things, you know, preserving individual, but really sort of splitting them all off into their individual, identities. Whereas, of course, plants grow as communities and within interspecies sort of relations. And so, yeah, as you say, what is lost in that type of conservation?
And then I guess also then I go back, like one of the aims of the exhibition being sort of what new imaginaries are possible and what new kinds of relationships can be formed. And I guess, yeah, because we're like thinking about plants growing in community, and sort of the way, I guess, yeah, the plant, like what is something I'm kind of thinking about sort of ongoing. What is a plant in the sense of like, what is an essence of a plant, which again, goes back to what you were saying earlier about sort of it has a different sort of effective temporal register on individualism versus collectivism. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Plants, individual, collective, and sort of, so what is gained? Because if we think about sort of, if I think about sort of trying to, again, problematize the relationship of plants in the home, we have, I think I have my visual aid again. So I have my potted plants, as you have your potted plants. So we have this plant, it's not, I suppose if we think about it, it's not just plant, it's the plant as well as the growing media that has come from wherever it's come from. It's kind of, which is then sort of interacting with the water, which has different microbes and other sort of nutrients. And yes, just thinking about how that again changes, the plant is never kind of just the plant, it's everything that sort of the plant is growing with. And I suppose even I think I said in the interview that I did with the It's Freezing in LA magazine, sort of like the carbon dioxide exchange, like the sort of bacteria in my breath is sort of even going into the kind of the plant's membranes. So I think, so then this is the question. I suppose then what kind of, what's happening in New Zealand now, or would you say more about kind of the sort of invasiveness or sort of, did they have to, what do they have to do to get plants to sort of acclimate and pollinate? And I think in some of our, for people that are in here, we did we had a planning meeting, and I remember you talking about a show on border control, and it'd be great to sort of hear about that as well. Just sort of the leftovers of sort of these practices that we really aren't spoken about, or that prop up in sort of bizarre ways.
Definitely. Well, yeah, just two thoughts. I mean, firstly, I think it's really interesting that you sort of stress how plants are all of these things, whereas the way that we stage domestic houseplants especially is very sort of individualistic, right? It's very removed, and I mean, when you were talking about how it is also the pot and the soil, I was literally thinking about that for the first time, and I can't believe that I haven't sort of given much thought to what soil I use to sort of pot things, and how that affects what this sort of object living being is and becomes in relation to all these different things, because it's one individual plant on its own, which is, I guess, much easier to define as a plant than when you go out in the garden and see kind of a sort of clump of shrubs and things that you're you can't identify the individual plant because they're all kind of connected, or they're rhizomatic and they sort of pop up all over the place. So definitely interesting. And in terms of sort of, I guess, the contemporary biosecurity regime of New Zealand, I mean, New Zealand has one of the most expensive and most elaborate biosecurity regimes anywhere in the world, for good reason, to try and protect a lot of its endemic species that don't sort of exist anywhere else. But it's this bizarre kind of cultural obsession, I guess, as I was saying with that. There's this TV program all about sort of airport biosecurity, which seems to be everywhere in New Zealand. Every time I switched on the TV, this program was playing, and it's an incredibly sort of action focused, really sort of hyped up. It's bizarre how they do it, and it's sort of and it's not about drugs or anything, but it's just about finding this obscure sort of herb that someone's trying to import from China, and that when they discover this, it's the most exciting thing, and it's so dramatic, and they have this music playing, and it's wow. And so the kind of way that this is framed as a sort of event, as a spectacle, really speaks volumes about how important these sorts of relations are in New Zealand today. And it's very much a sort of war on certain sort of invasive species. But I guess this also makes me think of Val Plumwood, the sort of environmental philosopher. She's done a lot of work writing on, for example, the decolonial garden. And she makes the point, within the context of settler colonies especially, that you can't just have a straightforward reversal of native versus non-native plants, or species. You can't simply place value on the native and not on the non-native, because it's more complicated than that, because new ecologies have evolved. And to be properly decolonial, you need to engage with the sort of site-specific ecologies and care practices that are going on in these different spaces, and recognize that actually where we are now is not the same. We can't just get back to some imaginary sort of ideal.
Wilding.
Exactly. We can't get back to that, because then how far back do you go? You know, species have been circulating around the world for forever. So there is no sort of pristine nature that you can get back to, but instead you've really got to ground it in people's contemporary sort of ecological relations. And that is more of a sort of decolonizing move, to recognize that and to understand exactly the sort of interspecies relations that are going on, rather than just straightforwardly saying, well, I'm going to plant these native trees because they're native. It's like, well, actually, are they fire resistant? You know, would they actually cause a risk to other nature around them? And so on. So I think that's a really interesting, feature of this sort of recognition of the multi-species nature of plants, which often we sort of ignore because we think of them as the background, as the environment, I guess.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't know if you might be able to hear the dog squeaking a toy in the background. I muted my
a little bit.
It's interesting thinking about sort of that as a decolonizing practice. That I suppose because of other cultures' sort of different relations to the land that kind of are then, literally colonized. Because I wanted to ask you sort of more about I think you had said that the indigenous Maori people, just to sort of, if you could briefly touch on like kind of that aspect as it relates to, I guess, ethics and moralizing in the context of the settler colonies.
I mean, going back to the sort of 19th century work on flower shows and things within the UK context, as I was saying, flower shows were used to moralise individuals and the working classes. And this was directly translated out into New Zealand as a means of trying to civilise Indigenous communities, again with this common belief that if they engage with flower culture, then this would be a really sort of positive thing, and draw them into the cultural community. And I mean, one thing about settler colonial theory is that it's all about the elimination of the native, right? And this can happen in a sort of very overtly violent way, and a literal killing of people or displacing them, and taking of land and such, but it can also relate to a sort of more general cultural move of trying to bring people into the dominant British culture at that time. And flowers played a sort of central role in that, again, thinking there was a native school movement in 1880 going onwards, which established schools amongst Maori communities, and within the sort of rural villages themselves. And a European teacher would go and teach English language and teach sort of, there's one geography exam that I saw actually that was like, draw a map of Ireland and label Belfast and the River Shannon. And these are the sorts of things that were thought of as important to teach these Maori children, to draw them into sort of the British Empire. But importantly for us anyway, in 1880, the Native Schools Code stipulated that native school teachers would be required to establish a flower garden, and a garden that became the model garden of the community, to try and influence local Maori to copy that and emulate them. And there's very limited documentary evidence as to if this was successful or not, but certain schools also held flower shows again, for the local Maori specifically, to try and get them to participate in these kind of activities. And there was still this assumption that they didn't want to, or they weren't going to, because they were somehow less civilized. Which was untrue, because we do have evidence that they were participating at this time, and also that they were extremely skilled agriculturalists before the time of settling, and very keen at taking up every sort of opportunity of new flora that was coming in from the late 18th century. So all these things were completely unfounded and fundamentally racist forms of discrimination. But I think, again, the flower kind of plays a strange part in that, in representing something more, but also not just being representative, but also it has a lot of agency itself. It was believed to have a lot of agency, and literally, you know, having a fuchsia in your home was thought to extend that influence over the space of your home, over the space of your family, and was thought to sort of help you cultivate certain habits or behaviors, like opening your window and letting in sunshine and fresh air, which would freshen up your domestic space, and lead it to sort of become a cleaner space. Or it would encourage you to clean your plants if you could see the dust on them, for example, and that might then lead you to clean your children, because
Wow.
plants and children were sort of frequently conflated, you know, and it was easier to see wilting plants in unventilated air than it was to see wilting children in the same air. So it was all of these kind of commonalities that were drawn between plants and people at this time that had, a really sort of dubious civilizationary hierarchy behind them.
So I guess relating it to then, so I'm trying to relate it to the contemporary with houseplants as well, particularly on when you said about the influence of actions based on bringing the plant in the interior. It makes me think so much about sort of kind of what I think is a bit of an unfounded belief about sort of an additional excess of oxygen or filtration that's brought in through plants. And so I don't think it's been scientifically proven, or you have to have like a field of something. But it makes me so like those kinds of imaginaries that get sort of constructed based on plant cultivation, but then also on the kind of I guess it's the left or the lasting effects of colonialism and of empire. What it also makes me think of is the fact that, like, I guess it kind of ties into this conservation way that we think about around houseplants and then the sort of native environments. But this idea of circulation of plants and sort of, because I think I had mentioned to you at one point around sort of for me there was like this opposite of like the plants going from the UK to the context, whereas in sort of in this particular set of histories, as opposed to sort of in this particular contemporary set of practices, the plants kind of coming to the UK, and particularly because a lot of this is happening, or a lot of the growing is happening in Southeast Asia, in areas like Thailand and Indonesia. But it just, I suppose, this lasting effect of empire on sort of empire, as well as different kinds of economies that are propping up around houseplant growing, but then also what that means around sort of, I guess, ethics, and going back to legislation and sort of border control, particularly with Indonesia, because there's a plant genus like Aglaonema, which are being just completely decimated from their local environments to be shipped. I assume with phytosanitary, but in a way, because to my knowledge, like the Indonesian government is not, the infrastructure is not, what's the word? Expansive in a way to sort of kind of capture that. So then you have this demand of the kind of quote unquote Western world that are sort of in this post empire, or sort of places that have built these empires, creating this demand for these plants that are still having these lasting effects on places that were colonized. And to me, that it's just really insane, sort of, to kind of recognize and sort of consider how that kind of functions, and trying to bring that sort of effective response to our relationship with the plants we have in our homes.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, I mean, how did you feel, sort of, what was it like to see the plants that you were seeing in Brazil when you were there, you know, that were familiar to you from that other context, from your own house or whatever in the UK?
I think it was weird, because it was like, I think, as we said, like, as you mentioned before, like it wasn't just the plant. It was the plant, and with everything else, like it's not like there was like a single vine on a tree. It was like, here's a vine of this particular plant and loads of other vines of different kinds of plants. And it was sort of in that process of trying to differentiate is much more difficult. But also then seeing the different kinds of interspecies relations that you wouldn't necessarily see in the home in the UK, particularly around, like, I mean, the one thing that sticks out is ant species, because there's just like there's just ants all over the kind of the rainforest floor. And I remember multiple times, like I was collecting cuttings, say with the permission of the botanist that was with us. I feel like I need to like plug that. But there are multiple times where like I wouldn't think anything of it, but I would go to like cut a small like node of a plant, and all of a sudden I would be like, oh, an ant just bit me. So I think like it's just like there was just a different kind of recognition that these plants mean different things to different species, and sort of, yeah. And then which also then goes back to me going, okay, well, if this mass process of kind of circulation and establishment of new populations is happening in the interior, yeah, well, how can that be positive in a way that if it's already happening, it's like, again, we can't go, as you said, we can't go, at what point do we go back to, like, so how can we sort of work with that, or sort of what new practices or what kind of new knowledges might we be able to seek, to, I suppose, just to create a better kind of co-living situation, and also understand better the kind of local ecologies around us, sort of in that context, and becoming curious about that. So I mean, that's what it was. Yeah, it was, and it was just bizarre. And then also, and just seeing, because the trees are so tall, so often I'd be looking up and it'd be like, oh, I recognize that, but it's like but as opposed to like, it's not in a pot on my table, it's like in a tree canopy.
Sorry to interrupt you guys. I just want to, because I'm conscious of time, and I just wanted to say to everyone, if you have some questions, now is the time to start typing them, or to ask them out, so we can make sure that we can have a conversation. Sorry, finish your phrase if you I cut you in the middle.
Oh no, I mean, thank you for doing that. Like, and also, just I think in our sort of, I have like a question that we want to sort of pose to the audience, is going back to kind of what Anna had said about sort of what is it that is different about the affectivity of kind of relating to plants, and memory, and sort of creation of identity that is different to other objects, because of the uniqueness of the sort of plant materiality and being. So just something to think about or to discuss with the audience. Thanks.
Yeah. And can I just sort of add another point of something that I'm sort of interested in, is how individual plants sort of create or co-create their sort of personality. How does that come through? What does plant charisma kind of mean, I guess? And is it true that sort of our individual relationships to plants within our home, within domestic spaces, do they create meaningful sort of ethics of care beyond that space, I guess? Does that translate to a sort of broader care for non-human nature outside of the home? Or is it more that it's actually our sort of intentions behind that, and our own motivations, in terms of perhaps we recognize our multi-species entanglement in the world, which others might not think about. Maybe that's more important than actually our bodily engagements, or it all sort of is tangled up together. But I think, plant charisma and how that stimulates a sort of more than human ethics is interesting.
That's super interesting. Personally, what I can think of is that on the days where I really take care of my plants, which means I clean their leaves and I check that everything is fine around them, those are also the days where I take care of my environments more. And usually it starts from actually taking care of the plants, and then it becomes a bit contagious, as if it really touches everything that is around them as well, and myself. So that day, I've actually noticed it, I'm reading on my diaries, that those must be the day where I actually take care of myself and my person more. So I definitely feel this this dynamic, which is actually very interesting hearing you talking, guys. I never thought that plants make us do things, and they are more them domesticating us than the way around. And all these gestures, opening the window and making sure the dog or the cat are not gonna eat that leaf or that flower, and it's in a safe, that the root or the cat, it's in a safe place. It's actually engender all this motion of bodies around the plant itself, and it's incredible. And then link with this, I actually had a question, but I don't know if it's the moment now. I can also save it for later. I was wondering, do animals, domestic animals, I'm thinking about cats especially, because they have a tendency of being a bit annoying and like coming around your plants and eat them, if they like the plant or not. But do cats, domestic animals need time to acclimatize as well to a foreign plants, especially if it's a plant that comes from like an environment that is not their native? I don't know if this makes much sense. And I don't know if, if you want to answer to this.
I mean, I personally can't really speak to animals at all, because I've never personally had pets and things, and I just haven't personally experienced that at all. But I imagine that it must be so, right? That it must be very different to introduce new things to the environment.
Just
Yeah, there is a question in the chat. Oh, don't worry, Emmy. Yeah, just mute yourself.
Okay, great. Hi. That was really fantastic. That was a really interesting bringing together of things. One of the things that really struck me was the parts about herbariums as domesticating spaces in certain situations, like, you know, native school teachers having to plant gardens. But the fact that over here herbariums are almost the opposite. They're like modes of travel. You have these passport plants, so it's like they're both domesticating and globalizing. I want to ask a question about basically COVID and lockdown and flower shows. Like, have you given much thought? I mean, I'm sure Matthew definitely has, in terms of him creating this virtual exhibition, but I wonder if you've given much thought to the kind of remediatization of flower shows right now. A couple of things that have happened recently, like if you remember or saw the moonflower flowering, where everybody watched the live streaming of a flower flowering, but like around this time every year there would usually be like orchid shows or cherry blossom shows, and sometimes they've moved online. And I wonder the way that herbariums play out this politics between both domesticating and globalizing and being a form of travel, but also a form of homemaking, is quite weird when we're accessing it remotely in lockdown. So I just wondered if like there's some things to kind of ask ourselves about the remediatization aspect.
Anna, do you want to talk about the flower shows aspect? That's something I mean, although I know it's contemporary, but I can also jump in if you prefer.
You jump in. I mean, I'm just trying to sort of rack my brains, but I don't think apart from the moonflower, as you mentioned, I don't think I've come across any sort of virtual engagements with plants. More so animals, I guess, which are easier. But I mean, I suppose my only comment would be obviously on the sort of temporality of it, and in terms of the time lapse that it can, provide, that gives us much more of an immediate sort of relationship to the plants, which otherwise we wouldn't have. I guess my knowledge on flower shows comes from a very different direction in terms of sort of horticultural society, very structured kind of competitive arenas, which are very bizarre spaces.
I suppose from can I say consumer aspect as opposed to competitive? I'm trying to be conscious of sort of language and who that kind of categorizes. But one thing that's kind of that has occurred to me on sort of the sort of re-immediacy of these kinds of spaces. At least I can talk about it in terms of houseplants. I can't necessarily talk about it in terms of although interesting houseplants are now becoming parts of flower shows as far as I'm aware. So one thing that happened recently in Florida, there's a society called the International Airway Society, which has like a whole, for people that aren't aware, it's got a whole collection of botanists, growers, hobbyists. They have a journal that is very scientific in nature, but they have an annual show every year at the Fairchild Tropical Gardens, I think it's called, near kind of South Florida and Miami. And they actually went ahead, they postponed it, but to February, and then it went ahead, and there was a lot of uproar around even having an in-person event because because of COVID. And so I've seen a couple of things in that aspect around sort of this desire to see the plants in person, but also thinking about the health sort of and what that means and sort of circulating as well, because people travel to come to these spaces and then go back, and that obviously is an issue for transmission of bacteria and viruses. The other thing I suppose that's kind of relevant here and thinking about the way that we experience the screen and plants and I suppose in circulation is that I guess all of the plant buying is kind of virtual. So it's like you don't get the plant, you get the product page. And so often it's not the product page. It's like, I mean, let's see if I can kind of do it. It's like, here's this really desirable like close up of a leaf that like with the leaf and it's like really like look, it's like arts like type of thing. And I think, and it's just, and maybe it puts a different emphasis on the kinds of aesthetics because it's not about, I guess then it goes back into this idea of class, like who has like the best sort of aesthetic plants as opposed to, I don't know, who has the plant that's growing the best in their space. I mean, I guess that's my initial thing, but do you want to come back? Because I know we've just talked a lot and I want to make sure I answer all parts of your question.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, thank you.
I just had a thought about flower shows though, in terms of like, I wonder if any flower show around the world has sort of gone ahead without showing it to anyone virtually or anything, just for the, who's it for? Like for the flowers to have them flower, because obviously it is still a cultivation of sort of beings. So wouldn't that be lovely to have a sort of flower show for the flowers rather than actually for a sort of external aesthetic appreciation that we're putting on it?
Yeah, that's really interesting as well, isn't it? In terms of the fact that like a lot of, I don't know, zoos and aquariums had their strange events where they were like, oh, we've brought some animals into the gallery because it's weird for them not to be visited. But like, what if we started thinking about plants like that? Like, what if the plants are feeling weird because nobody's visiting them?
Exactly. Well, they had the only thing that I can think of was somewhere in Europe, I can't remember where, they had a concert for plants. Do you remember seeing? They shipped in a load of houseplants and put them in all of the audience chairs, and some people played a concert for the plants, and it was kind of general uproar online of, oh god, these plants are going to be all dislocated and they're not going to enjoy that kind of move to be stuck inside in this concert hall. Like, what a strange thing. But it was meant to be kind of emphasizing the sort of pandemic and what this has meant for people and plants. That's the only thing I can remember of. Yeah, there we go.
I did see that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then it makes me think like the plants are like acclimatizing. Are the plants more focused on the stress, or are they focused on like what part of their sensory sort of input system is like being kind of, I suppose, stimulated? Like, or is it actually like, are they internal? Sorry.
Yeah, do they enjoy the music? Do they enjoy the vibrations and things? Or is it actually just incredibly unpleasant? They're just sitting there sort of screaming internally. Yes. Why are you doing this?
Yeah. Oh, there's another question.
I'm just reading, out loud the chat. Thank you for this rich conversation, and I wonder if there is any archival material in the period you're looking at around Maori uses of plants, relations to plants, or whether there are other kinds of archives beyond the more official colonial archive.
Definitely. I mean, this is a really interesting question, and for me, it speaks very much to the sort of ethics of archival work that I've been dealing a lot with. And in terms of what sort of work is it all right for me to be doing on these communities, I guess, because there are a lot of very clear guidelines that have been established around how to do archival work within Maori ethical sort of frameworks, which involve engaging very closely with specific communities, with Maori language, and having a sort of sustained connection and relation to individuals. Which obviously sort of is beyond the remit of a 3-year PhD in Britain. And so I've had to sort of think about how to frame work around this, I guess, in sort of in terms of what sources I can access. And fundamentally, absolutely that this angle, like the Maori experience, will not be seen through official sources of newspapers and letters and things. It's just not there. So you would have to do a lot more sort of oral history research, or looking at different sorts of sources, which either I couldn't personally access or I didn't feel that I ethically should be able to access. And I suppose, so I managed to track down a few descendants, or actually, well, one reached out to me, descendants of some Maori individuals that I'd been researching, that I did meet and talk to. And so I sort of got an insight in that way. But it's incredibly hard to trace what was sort of going on at this time, I suppose. But in terms of sort of Maori connections to plants, there are a lot of sort of medicinal plants and alternative uses that were being practiced throughout the 19th century, and actually were incredibly resilient to settler colonial relations, and a lot of traditional uses of plants for food and for medicine and for all sorts of different purposes have managed to exist into the present day. And there are now sort of moves for community gardens to reattach people to their land that was lost through settlement. And there's that move today to reconnect people to the ground as a means of sort of restitution, I suppose, in the contemporary world.
Thank you, Anna. There is another question from Ola. Ola, if you want to unmute yourself or type it in as you wish.
Hi. Yes. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So I guess I really enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much for. Sorry about the dog. So much for sharing this really fascinating work. I'm kind of with the Maori too. I understand that the idea of preserving things that are being lost is quite important, but I kind of see where the Victorians went when they brought all those seeds, and they were just homesick. They're basically as being settlers and all. It's a complicated situation, isn't it? As an immigrant myself, I'm just thinking, do I grow plants that I'm familiar from back home here? And you see, there's this whole emotional conundrum happening, to decide what should one grow and propagate and cultivate. Like, that's a very special word, cultivate. It's like making culture. You're producing cultural artifacts as well as you cultivating plants. Sort of goes hand in hand, and thinking behind it. Like, how do you address that emotional flavor of side of things in your work? I guess that's more like for Mathew, but both of you, really.
Yeah, do you want to take that, Mathew?
Yeah. I suppose plants that we should cultivate. Like, what immediately comes to mind, in a way, I suppose, and almost maybe the opposite. I guess I'm just going to say it. Like, so I mentioned I had the golden pothos that I showed on the screen earlier, and that is a plant that I suppose has a lot of sort of personal meaning attached to it for me, moving here from Florida, where I spent the majority of my childhood. And it's kind of interesting because I can't act like I'm not actually a large fan of Florida. Just the climate and the tourism just are not my favorite things. But it has a really great state park system and really amazing natural resources. And like the pothos, or pothos, I suppose, if you're from the States, it has like has a very like affected memory for me, because it was something that was always in the house growing up, and like I have one here. And I've been away now for a few years, and so going back to Florida, I was back last year before the pandemic. It's amazing to me that sort of seeing the plant has now, I think it was already classed as invasive, but going back to the parts that I grew up in, it was amazing that I would just see it just completely covering the sort of the native trees, that in that kind of short time span that I would have never just imagined, just to kind of see that like sort of firsthand. was just absolutely shocking to me. So I suppose I'm not, I don't know if I guess what I'm saying is I am completely taking on board what you're saying, and I'm not sure if I have a position on it yet, because it's something like, I guess it's less of a concern here because I assume if I put the pothos outside, it's not going to live. But that doesn't mean it would in another context, as it doesn't in Florida. But I guess maybe it's just this aspect of if we're going back to thinking about the new possibilities, I guess, and then thinking about design. How do we design spaces? How do we create culture in homes that kind of that where we can have these things around us, but still, I guess, in a way that's manageable, or that safeguards the local ecologies, or that works with the local ecologies in a way that is currently unseen. But I don't know if I have an answer to that. I'm sorry, that was a long ramble to say I don't have an answer, but just to say, I hope the anecdote is helpful in the sense that it is something that I'm kind of considering. Do you want to add anything, Anna? I suppose it's maybe on the context of seeing plants that you would have seen in the UK and in New Zealand. Or if wanting to take plants back.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the sort of question of emotion, I guess with plant research in general, it's very easy to get caught up in the kind of romance of it all somehow, and sort of seeing plants as very, sort of beautiful things, and that spark a sort of very strong emotional response in people, for better or for worse, I suppose. And then when it sort of starts becoming complicated by invasive species and sort of what should be where and how do we evaluate that, then where does the sort of initial emotion come into it in terms of, for example, plants that were introduced to New Zealand for sort of emotional reasons that are now taken over as invasive species? How do you write that, as you say, the sort of homesickness into that story, and where does that stand? And it's not in terms of sort of justifying these things at all, really, but it's sort of an important explanatory factor, because it's sort of part of that whole the world. It sort of explains why things are the way they are, and I think it's important to attend to, but it's difficult to do that without kind of getting swept up in the romance of it, I find, anyway, in my research, especially reading these really emotive diaries of these women who just desperately want their snowdrops in New Zealand, and yet it's still a sort of a colonial move of colonizing ground with these plants. So sort of how do you balance these things is really interesting.
And also not take it out on the plants,
absolutely, yeah. Which so many people do, exactly, in terms of sort of invasive species, which I guess is a sort of can be seen as a positive form of stewardship in terms of managing that land and allowing other species to flourish in these sort of novel ecosystems. But yeah, the sort of rhetoric behind that can be, well, it's been criticised obviously for being incredibly sort of racist or sort of anti-immigrant. These sort of anti-invasive species discourses, for sure. Are there any other questions?
If there are no questions, this is the time to drop in the chat. Thank you. This is very fascinating. Thank you for your question as well.
I mean, I can think of something. If nobody else is coming forward with a question, that it's always been playing on my mind in terms of thinking about plants, is a lot of this research on plants always comes back to this fundamental question of, can we ever properly know the plant? And if we can, how do we do that? Is it through recognizing our similarities, or is it through sort of acknowledging and respecting our differences? And so much of this work comes down to that sort of really fundamental divide. So I was just interested, does anyone have any sort of thoughts on, because I sort of know where I stand on this, but it seems to be a very divisive sort of argument, I think. So yeah, Matthew, do you have any idea of where you stand on this?
I'm just I'm the opposite. No, we have to, the plants have to be dealt with on their own. And I mean, I guess, but then maybe to not put it back to you, but I just, because you're more familiar with the kind of discourse side of it, is there, are the people that are making cases as with a lot of, I guess, work now. Like, it's not a binary. Like, are there people that sort of that talk about this? Because I mean, I can obviously understand the why we talk about difference and similarity or versus similarities cross species. But yeah, is there kind of a discourse for that, or maybe a question: should there be a discourse for it? Because my immediate response is like, no, yeah, again, as I said, they have to be different.
Yeah, because I mean, well, the people that I always keep coming back to here, just to drop in a few theorists, are Michael Marder, who's always very much on the side of, no, plants are this unknowable other that must be held at a distance. They're a complete alien and we can never properly understand them. And this is a sort of necessary thing to understand, versus, for example, Matthew Hall's book, Plants as Persons, where he's like, well, actually, no, in lots of indigenous cultures especially, plants are understood as people, and we do have a literal sort of shared materiality, understood sort of through I suppose creation histories in indigenous contexts, but also through a scientific sort of context of, well, if we go back however many billion years, we were all made from the same stuff. So you can kind of cut it both ways, I guess. But then again, coming back to Val Plumwood's work, actually, in her work on sort of dualism, then she's sort of saying, well, no, actually, we need to hold the both of them in balance. We can't just say that it's one or the other. But when we come to relating to the sort of non-human world in general, we've got to appreciate both of these things. So then in my mind, I suppose it comes down to sort of being strategic about it, I guess. And it's sort of, for example, strategic anthropomorphism or phytomorphism. And why, what are our motivations behind this? And I think you can get away with a lot if you've got sort of good motivations in terms of, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to understand yourself through the plants, or are you trying to sort of impose control onto them? And I think anthropomorphism or phytomorphism can work both ways. We can see ourselves in others, but we can also see others in ourselves. And I think that you can definitely do that with plants, even though it might be a bit harder. But I personally think that that's a really important step on the way to sort of a non-human empathy and establishing an empathy amongst people and plants, because without that, where are you?
I saw a great talk. I saw a great succession of remarks once, which was after Michael Marder gave a talk, which was very much about plant thinking, and Kate Sandilands spoke immediately after him. And I think she gave a really good response where, she basically was saying this isn't always the best model for empathy anyway, this idea of like thinking differently as this other species. I think at the time, like in that panel or whatever, we were talking about forests, so that was the focus. So she was sort of explaining what's lacking in what might look like empathy, because it's very it's projecting, right? But or it's projecting empathy, but she, was making a really good point, which is it's not really about plants thinking, like divorcing ourselves of ourselves, but it's about what are we to the plants. And that is something that you drop and let go of, and you are no longer being pragmatic or responsible when you let go of that and you get carried away with the empathy of plant thinking. And I thought that was just such a great point, like right after Michael Marder presenting in the way that he tends to. So yeah, I just think that exchange is quite interesting, or that tension.
Absolutely, it's something to hold both of them. I think you can't come down on one side or the other, because you've got to appreciate both, and also to appreciate the sort of specificities of individual plants, right? Because it's always going to be completely different depending on the plant or the person or the creature or the space, which is the joy of geography. Attention to space, spatial relations.
Sorry, just briefly, Ludo, is the meeting gonna end in 5 seconds, or are we okay to go over time?
Yeah, the talk might could last a little longer, but let's wrap it up so we are sure that everyone is still in this conversation in hand, and unless you guys have other things, other questions, other remarks to say. Thank you so much. Really, truly, it was really, really great, Anna, to have you here and conversation with Matthew. And thank you, Amy, for your participation as well, and Ola and Katie for the questions. Thank you, everyone. Yes. Do you have anything else to say? Please go ahead. I just wanted to wrap it up, but yeah, feel free to say anything else you want. And Matthew put in the chat the 3 names of the persons that they were mentioning. So
Amy mentioned one more. So Amy, do you mind typing it in the chat? You said it was someone that was speaking after Michael Martin.
Katrina Sandilands, yeah. Oh yes, Natasha Myers. Always Natasha Myers.
There will be a transcript of this chat that I will see. I would put the references of these people on the description of the talk that will be updated online. Thank you.